Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and it's time for another unscripted episode of Superhero Rewind. This time, let's do something completely different and talk about a season of television, shall we? Been a good long time since I've done that. Today we're going to talk about the 1987 original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, a show that I brought up in relation to lots of other projects. I've talked about the influence and inspiration this show has had on lots of other things, and not just Ninja Turtle stuff. I've talked about this in relation to particularly Power Rangers quite a bit. This is a show that I've wanted to talk about for a long time on its own, and I've thought about for years doing a top 10 list of episodes for this show, and I just haven't been able to take the time to watch through everything. This is 10 seasons of TV, and it's pretty redundant. It's even less bingeable, I think, than 60s Batman, which took a lot out of me, honestly, when I did the top 10 list for that. That was meant to be seen twice a week, and only twice a week, and I really felt it trying to watch that in just a few short weeks for review. So I did the same thing with this a few years ago. I watched a whole bunch of it, and it kind of fried my brain a little bit, and I ended up abandoning that project, and it was difficult to get excited about going back to it. So I said, what's something that I can do with this show that isn't that yet? Maybe eventually I can finally get to that, over a good amount of time, watch episodes, take some notes, figure out what my 10 favorites are, and then revisit those and talk about them. A thing I just haven't gotten around to yet. And I realized that the first season of this show is one decompressed story, basically the regular formula for an episode of this show spread out to 5 episodes, which aired over a week's time and was, I think, one of the most brilliant toy commercials of all time. This was a show that didn't have really any fanfare, not a whole lot of advertising around it when it aired. It itself was the advertisement for the product that it was really selling. It was not an end unto itself, but a means to an end, which of course was selling toys. That, of course, was not original for the 80s. He-Man and Masters of the Universe was that way, Transformers was that way, but what was different about Ninja Turtles is that it started as an adaptation of material outside of toys. Transformers is a toy in the first place, and this was a thing that Playmates thought would potentially make for great toys that children would want to buy, but they didn't know exactly how to get children to get excited about the product because the source material wasn't really for them. It was aimed more at adults. The original Ninja Turtles comics, the Mirage comics by Eastman and Laird, were for an older audience, or at least a teenage audience, and they were gritty parodies primarily of Frank Miller stuff, especially Daredevil. And they were low print runs, and they were independent comics, and they were very underground. And yet they were getting a lot of traction in the comic world, and a lot of people reading comics were getting into them and really loved that property. And so there was a very, very small base of people that would consider buying these toys. And of course, this was not a period where toys were really adult collector's items yet, by and large. And so if you were going to make toys based on that property, it was not just going to have to be in adaptation of those comics in another medium that more people were looking at, but it was going to have to be a different thing entirely so that the main demographic for action figures would be interested in the product, and so it had to be a cartoon show. So the cartoon was selling the toys in the same way as something like Transformers, certainly, but the original idea wasn't aimed at that demographic. So how do you make children care about that thing in the first place? And what I think was brilliant about it is that it was both dumbed down and kept kind of gritty looking all at the same time. This is not a show that holds up great overall going back to it as an adult, especially if you're a Ninja Turtles fan from any other versions of it in any media apart from this original cartoon. A lot of us that grew up with this show have a lot of nostalgia for it. We, I think, remember it as being a more serious thing than it is, like a lot of us that grew up with 60s Batman. And kind of like 60s Batman, it's a thing that knows exactly what it is and is kind of tongue-in-cheek about itself. But as kids, it seemed, and especially this show, a little bit more rough around the edges and a little bit edgier than it actually turned out to be. I said when I reviewed the Coming Out of Their Shells tour that this was a show that, unlike 60s Batman, didn't have a lot of extra layers that we would discover as we got older. We added layers to it when we were kids, and maybe we did that a little bit with Batman as well, where it seemed like a darker thing than it was, and we brought maybe more as children, more of the gravitas and the bite and the danger to it. But there was a adult satire and sensual nature to that show that you wouldn't necessarily appreciate as a 9 or 10-year-old. This show was very much for 9 or 10-year-olds and did not care if adults were watching. And I would argue that it even looks at the world through the lens of a child, but it presents, at least in landscapes and things, a world that looked kind of like the one that children were living in the 80s. I mean, it's New York City. It looks dilapidated. There is a lot of urban upheaval clearly going on, but a lot of the characters are goofy parodies of people in the real world or people in action movies. I think a lot of this is a kind of farcical depiction of the live action films that children would have been seeing at the time. Like your Die Hards and in just regular action fare, but also things like RoboCop in your science fiction and more fantasy fare. And so it is a silly, formulaic, cookie-cutter Saturday morning cartoon where the good guys are good, the bad guys are bad, there's really nothing in between, and it doesn't have a whole lot to say about anything. It's a lot more about just getting children to sit through the commercials and to then go buy the action figures that are very strategically sold to them episode to episode. One of the brilliant things about this initial miniseries is that each episode something new is added that's a major toy that was going to be in that first wave of toys. So in the first episode, of course, you have the turtles themselves and you have a glimpse of the Shredder, but you don't yet have the turtle van or the turtle blimp or any of those things. Gradually, it's all going to be added episode to episode, but each episode has at least one major toy that children are going to want to buy, and they're getting them every day of the week. So by the time they get to the end of that, the kids are, Monday to Friday, kids are going to want to, kids are going to be begging their parents to run out and get them every single thing that they saw on that show, because they'll be able to buy all of it and recreate what they just watched. So then in that second episode, you get Krang and the Technodrome. The third episode, you get the Mouser robots and Baxter Stockman, but not Fly Baxter Stockman, so he's not going to have an action figure yet. And then the fourth episode, you're going to get the Turtle Van. You also, in I guess the previous episode, you get Bebop Rocksteady, and then in the fifth episode, you've got Krang's bodysuit and the blimp, and so some of the big, heavy-hitting, expensive items beyond the Technodrome from earlier. And I'm not sure when the sewer playset came in. That was probably released a lot later. But there's a lot of things, of course, in that first season that would be released as action figures and playsets later on as well. So I think it's a genius marriage of actual kiddie fare with the kind of iconography that tells children it's a little bit more grown up and looks like the kinds of things that their parents are watching that they're not supposed to be looking at. And Toei did the animation for the first season, which is why it looks so much better than a lot of the rest of the show. Not to mention the fact that some of the later seasons, there were too many episodes and it was really rushed, and so a lot of corners had to be cut. And there wasn't the kind of time and care and dedication put into each episode that there was this first season. So it's not biting off more than it can chew like it will later. That's not to say that there aren't any mistakes at all, or that it's always completely consistent. I think particularly the fourth episode, Hot Riding Teenagers from Dimension X, while it has some of the best animation in the season, some of the character models in places seem a little bit off to me. But all of the backgrounds and landscapes and vehicles and things incredibly well detailed, and it reminds me of some of the classic anime films that Toei did, and it's crazy seeing this material get that kind of treatment, again considering how unsophisticated the storytelling is, and how really silly and under detailed a lot of the character models are, particularly for a lot of the one-shot background throwaway characters that are very often made to look ugly and like they don't really fit in this universe, almost on purpose. Almost like the show is saying, this world is populated with idiots, and if there is some satire in the show, it's that there are a lot of dumb people in the world, and hey kids, we understand how you feel about adults and that you're afraid that this is what you'll grow up and turn into. And so there's a lot of catharsis, I think, for children in this show. Like I said, I think it's looking at the world through the lens of a kid. And it understands that a lot of kids would prefer to live vicariously through adults, or at least more grown-up characters in their fiction than they want to just see themselves running around, but they also want those characters to seem to understand them and where they're coming from. And that's part of the genius in turning Ninja Turtles into a little kid thing, because teenagers seem like the best of both worlds, where I get to grow up a little bit and get to do a lot more of the kinds of things that my parents won't let me do now. I get to drive cars and go to rated R movies, and people say that dating girls is supposed to be cool, even though I don't care about that yet, but I know that when I get older, that's what the cool kids are going to be doing. And yet they're not so grown up that they're not still having fun. The fourth episode, again, Hot Rodding Teenagers from Dimension X, particularly is about this, where you have an evil dimension where all of the adults only care about war, and it really oversimplifies and dumbs down the plight of adulthood, that at some point you lose your childhood and all you care about is boring and seemingly pointless and even mean-spirited grown-up stuff, like going to war with people. The neutrinos, the teenagers from Dimension X, don't understand why the Utroms and the Stone Warriors and whoever else over in the hellish-looking, always perpetually red Dimension X are doing to each other. They don't understand why they're at war all the time. And we're never told that either, because the show doesn't know, and the show doesn't care. But also, my read on it is, this is not a show from the adult's perspective. This is all about kids. More grown-up kids than the 7, 8, 9-year-olds that it's mostly aimed at, but still kids. And from, again, a kid perspective, adults go to war. They fight each other. They don't know how to get along. And we don't really want to be like them when we grow up. I don't want to say, of course, that there's particularly sophisticated social commentary here, but there is a satirical element there. It's dumbed down to the point of, with the neutrinos, the adults won't let us have any fun. And Krang, as one of those adults, says the neutrinos don't care about war, and all they want to do is have fun. The whole thing is about selling toys to children while saying, we understand where you're coming from and how weird the world looks from a child's perspective, and then giving them a blown out, ultra creative, imaginative world to look at and then go play with. And I think that's why the show is so popular. It's an incredible balancing act of so many different elements. And it, like 60s Batman again, was exactly what was needed right then at that time, I think, for that age group. You're right at the end of the Cold War. A lot of kids are seeing a lot of violence on their streets. This is a thing that looks bleak and depressing, at least in that first season, that is also really lighthearted and escapist fun. And it kind of says maybe you can still have fun in the dark and bleak looking world that you live in. And that golden age classic notion of good versus evil, and that the universe will reward the good guys who do the right thing at the end of the day, has not been lost, no matter how dark and depressing the world seems now. The show obviously loses a lot of that as it goes along, and I keep making this comparison, but also just like 60s Batman, it starts in a super comedic place, which is where it will always live, but it looks a little bit darker and a little bit soberer at the beginning, and it becomes more slapsticky, and it looks a lot more bright and chipper very quickly after the first episode in the 60s Batman case, and after the first season in this case, which is kind of a crying shame, and more so with this show, because what it really had going for it, I think, is that dichotomy, that juxtaposition of how it looks tonally versus the kinds of stories that it's telling. And a lot of the staples from this first season, the show won't lose, but because it's not allowed to be as gritty looking as it is this first season, and I'm not saying it's really dark, it's really gritty, but it's a lot grittier, and I think it holds up a lot better in this first season, and it also, again, helps that the animation is so good, that later seasons pale in comparison, and that balance is kind of lost a little bit. The Turtles themselves get sillier and goofier and don't take things as seriously as they do the first season. And April even complains that the Turtles at the beginning of this show don't ever take anything seriously. And the Turtles say, yeah, we don't if we can help it. But they do sober up and start really paying attention when things go wrong, and they kind of get down to business and strap in and do their jobs. And they seem to have just that standard like late 80s, early 90s teenage attitude of, let's just not take the world too seriously. We're going to play until it makes sense not to. So if the chips are down and things really get out of hand, we'll wise up and do what's necessary. But if it's not, we're going to mess around, and we're going to eat a lot of pizza, and we're going to crack a lot of jokes, and we're going to put on goofy disguises just because we can, and we don't care what anybody thinks of us. I also think one of the reasons that this show appealed to kids so much was because the basic premise is about outcasts, and every kid at one time or another feels like an outcast, feels like they were born in the wrong time, or the world isn't, what is in the world isn't really for them, and they don't want to grow up and be their parents. They don't want to grow up and run the world the way it is and become the people who are currently running the world. I think that's a lot of kids' greatest fear, and at least it certainly felt that way when I was a kid. And this is a show about mutant turtles. these creatures where there's nobody else in the world like them. They have to hide. They can't let anybody see who they really are, which is a thing that I think every young person, again, at one time or another, can identify with. And again, that's inherent in the premise. You can't give the show itself too much credit for that. And it loses some of that after this first season because I think it makes a big misstep in letting the Turtles get outed and everybody knows about them after this miniseries. I think it should have taken longer than that. And I think that a lot of the popularity of the Turtles in general was because of this first season and not as much the rest of the show. Now, obviously, it stayed popular for a very long time, and kids liked a lot of episodes and new characters that were added, but I would go as far as to say, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that if the show had started looking and feeling more like the second season at the very beginning, it may not have caught on as hard as it did. The Turtles just look more edgy and provocative early on than they will later, particularly because of the way the action figures were designed. And the figures, if I remember the story correctly, were developed based on the Mirage comics initially, and not based on animation cells, because nothing had been done yet on the show. And they were changed slightly to match what they'll look like in the show, but I don't think really in the face. When I imagine the Turtles, they always have that teeth-gritting expression where their mouth is closed in the middle, but it's open on the sides. And they do that a lot in this first season, and I don't remember that as much later on. In fact, what I remember is they look more like the action figures in the intro with the theme song, but they don't in the actual episodes proper. That's not true in the first season. They do that kind of thing a lot more, and we also get to see them do a lot more legitimate fighting and action. They seem as much like ninjas as they do in the movie, and I think that fun joke from the film is also here, where they don't seem all that concerned about being in the shadows and about fighting stealthily, but we talk about them like they do. And there's this kind of tongue-in-cheek joke about that, where the Shredder recognizes the ancient fighting style of the Foot. The same thing really happens in the movie. And it's a lot of fun. But later on, just like looking at the 1990 movie to Secret of the Ooze, I don't know if it's because parents complained or if the show just got away from this because it was going in more and more of a typical Saturday morning cartoon direction. I suspect maybe a little bit of both. But the Turtles stop using their weapons as much when they're fighting. And the action scenes are reduced more and more as the show goes along, maybe until the last couple seasons when it tries to wend itself back around to being a little bit grittier and a little edgier and looking more like the movie, all the way to, in the last season, using scenes from the movie in the intro, like protesting too much, trying too hard to tell kids, no, this is what you remember from that movie. And it's also a few years too late at the point that happens. The show certainly has to deal with censorship, and it certainly has to try not to be too scary. But the Turtles are allowed to use their weapons more in this first season, and they're mostly fighting robots, certainly. There's a really good reason that the foot soldiers are mechanical in this, because the Turtles are able to hack and slash through them, and we don't have to worry about parents complaining and about the censors not allowing things on the air with that. And we have lots of robots. You've got the Mousers in the third episode, and Krang's big bodysuit. When we finally fight Krang, that's a big mech robot. So it feels a lot more like a martial arts driven action show than it will be allowed to later on. Of course, the film and the show were developed separately, but as the show got popular, while the film was in production, some things were changed to match it more and to appeal to the kids that were watching the show. And I think in some ways that helped the movie, and in very very few small ways maybe it hurt it a little bit. And it didn't seem to affect the movie too much. It didn't seem like it wasn't allowed to be the more gritty independent film that it was trying to be, just because it was trying to include the kids a little bit. In fact, I don't think it was suddenly aimed at the children more than it just knew that some of those kids would be watching, so it got a few references to the show in there and made sure that the kids felt included. But it didn't dumb anything down, it didn't get rid of any of the violent aspects of it. And so April is a reporter, and she's got her yellow jumpsuit for a scene, and it uses the logo from this show, which of course it wouldn't have looked like that if the show had never been made. But by and large, it's a lot closer, of course, to the Mirage comics still than it is this show. But I was surprised going back to this to see all the parallels to the movie that I had forgotten about, some of which might have been intentional, and many of which I imagine were coincidental. Some of it probably because they're both based on the same source material, and some of it maybe just because of whatever was in the air at the time. I didn't remember that the show, just like the movie, opens with April O'Neil on the news talking about a crime wave. And it's, of course, not about the same things. It's not like the movie, which is the most interesting thematic thing the film is doing, dealing with that family idea where the Shredder is trying to become a father figure for all of these kids that he's conscripting into his gang. None of that, of course, is here because his whole gang is made up of robots, and he's able to make a robot gang because he built a technodrome with Krang, and he's got all this technology from Dimension X. So once you put those two things together, this Shredder has vast resources that he doesn't have in the movie, and so it makes a lot of sense that you wouldn't go to those kinds of thematic places. I think that, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, there are inherently some interesting kind of classic superhero ideas and also some family ideas that aren't really explored or developed very much because the show isn't as concerned with them as it is with making the Turtles look like fun characters to play with in action figure form. But the crime wave here is that the Shredder just keeps stealing technology from everywhere, and no one knows who's doing it and why it's disappearing. And I do really appreciate that we're not as nonsensical about resources and where stuff comes from as a lot of Saturday morning cartoons. It certainly plays fast and loose with it, but we actually know where the Shredder gets all of his weaponry and all of the metal that he uses in Krang's inventions and all of that. And we kind of know where Donatello gets his stuff, although that's a little bit of a harder pill to swallow, because some of the stuff that he's able to make in the sewer just out of trash is as unbelievable as it is in Steel, which I reviewed a couple episodes ago. But it is nice that there's as much of an internal logic to this as there is, and that's a thing I think the show also starts to lose as it goes along. But I want to talk about a couple of other movie connections that I was surprised to see revisiting this. April's second time around shop, of course, the antique shop, isn't in this show, but there's a stand-in for the destruction of that shop, which is, of course, in the early Mirage comics, and that's adapted to the movie, and that's when the Mouser robots end up destroying her apartment building, and so April is actually thrown out of where she lives and loses her home. That usually happens with the Turtles real early, but it actually happens with April. And you even get that classic entrance for the Turtles that you get in the movie. It's not as effective, certainly, partly because of just the cartoony character designs in the show. The outlines don't work as well in silhouette as they do in the movie, but we do introduce the Turtles in shadow in this. They get that kind of reveal. And I was also surprised to relearn, because it's been a while since I've seen this, that at the end of this, and I used to complain about this all the time with the movie, you get the same thing where Shredder isn't beaten by the Turtles, but is in fact beaten by his old arch enemy, Splinter. And that's where some of the inherent pathos comes in. And I don't mean that this show actually has a lot of real honest-to-God pathos, but you have some of these ideas that I wish were a little bit more in the fore because they're great on paper. And they do create a good sense of urgency in the context of this show. You've got Splinter destroying his one chance to become human again in order to save the Turtles, in order to save his boys. And that's some pretty good dramatic stuff that you don't really have in any other version. The Shredder has an anti-mutagen gun, and he is going to shoot the Turtles with it to turn them back into real regular turtles. Tonight I dine on turtle soup. And his classic memorable line from the show. And Splinter throws his staff and breaks the gun, and now he's not going to be to have any chance at becoming human again. Now, I don't remember later on in the show if Shredder ever has anti-mutagen again. I suspect that he does, but since there still is a Technodrome, the Turtles and Splinter have to be thinking that it's possible for Shredder and Krang to make that thing again, and maybe they still have a hope of turning him back. But again, it's a good dramatic situation, and one of the great choices that this show makes is, and I think that this is a strategic move for children, certainly, but it's a great idea, and it's something that, like with so many things in this show, the Tom Waltz IDW comics run with and bring some real sophistication and character dimension to, is the idea that instead of being Hamato Yoshi's pet rat, Splinter is in fact Hamato Yoshi himself. And so he has this tragic kind of Frog Prince thing where he has turned into a rat, and that is his lot in life, and it's because he did the right thing and had to pay for it. But the universe will pay him back by giving him the Ninja Turtles, sons that he can be proud of. And it's weirdly a lot more believable, again, within the context of this absurd material in the first place, than the way it's usually handled, which is in the movie and the Mirage comics, where Splinter is just Yoshi's pet rat who seems smarter than your average rat and has been mimicking his master's movements and knows martial arts already before he's transformed, and just takes the teachings of Yoshi and passes them down to his children, to the Ninja Turtles. I honestly think that change is just made because cartoon shows in the late 80s are not allowed to really kill off anybody, and you'll have to say that the Shredder murdered Hamato Yoshi, and then Splinter has this person to avenge, and this isn't a show that's really going to go to those kinds of places. And so I think it was probably just a censor thing and one of the many, many ways to lighten the show up and make it more kid-friendly. But it has the added benefit of creating some real logical stakes for our characters and giving everybody real solid motivations. I know what everybody wants throughout this show. There is a place, and I'll talk about this in a second, where the Turtles seem to kind of forget why they're doing what they're doing, and that's weird, but everybody wants something, and that doesn't automatically, of course, mean that they're real, fleshed out, complex, layered, three-dimensional characters, but I do appreciate that it's not just a bunch of random things happening, and I think it makes it easier for kids to feel like there's real stakes, that there is real danger, and to be able to put themselves in the shoes of their protagonist. So the Turtles want to turn their master human again, because that's the main thing that he wants. or at least they think it is. Of course, what he wants more than anything is for his boys to be safe and okay. And of course, that's sympathetic and endearing. And then what our bad guys want is different for each of them, which is supposed to create in a situation of intrigue and potential backstabbing and double-crossing, which disappointingly never happens. That's one of the big missed opportunities with this show, I think, is that Shredder and Krang turn into... And this is one of the more fun things to tune in for later on, but it's a relationship that starts off real trepidatious and uncertain. It's an uneasy alliance, and it ultimately just turns into an old married couple. But early on, it's Shredder wants to take over the city. He's a very simple villain. I don't know how he gets to that. I don't know why exactly he wants that, except that he was in the same dojo, in the same clan, the Foot Clan, as Hamato Yoshi back in Japan, and he was just a bad guy. He was just a bully. And he took over the Foot Clan for his own ends, and he just likes power, and he wants to rule things. Standard Saturday morning cartoon villain. It kind of pretends like there's more weight to it somehow than there is, but that's really all there is. And Krang also wants to rule, but he cares more about his home dimension, which he wants to get back to, because he's been exiled somehow to our dimension, and all he wants is his body back. And he can't do anything as an ineffectual brain that doesn't have opposable thumbs and just writhes around with tentacles. And so both of them need each other, and neither of them trust the other, and they're just using each other for their own ends until they don't need the other one anymore. That plays out really wonderfully again in the Tom Waltz comics. There's some setup early on for an actual three-pronged war to happen, like it does in the comics, where it might be the Turtles versus Shredder and Krang, but also Shredder versus Krang at the same time. There could have been some enemy of my enemy is my friend, keep your friends close but your enemies closer stuff, particularly with the third episode, where a kidnapped Michelangelo is helped out by Krang, who is just using whoever he needs to in order to try to make Shredder finally make him his body, which is a really fun, totally absurd, wacky kind of situation for a couple of villains. And by the way, I think one of the things that this show had up on some other shows is that you had two central villains like that. That was kind of unusual. And I think that was done in order to bring in both of the major aspects of the comics simultaneously to appeal to kids in different avenues of toy selling. So instead of picking the more out there sci-fi stuff or the gritty urban street level stuff, it just did both at the same time. And that also might have come naturally to Fred Wolf and the guys putting the show together, because that's what the comics did as well. I think a lot of people forget or don't realize that the early Mirage comics weren't just the Turtles versus Shredder, and of course Shredder dies in that first issue famously. But it wasn't just Turtles versus the Foot Clan with a gritty street level crime drama and a ninja drama and using New York City as an urban jungle, but it also had the space stuff and the sci-fi stuff there from almost the very beginning. The Triceratons are there in like issue 3 or 4. It happens very quickly. There's a lot more versatility, a lot more different kinds of toys you can make if you embrace both of those aspects of Turtles. So it's a really natural thing to do, I think. You would think that there would be more of a parallel between Shredder and Splinter than there is, because in other material, again, particularly the movie, Shredder is a negative father figure. He is the guy who doesn't really care about his children, the teenagers that he brings into his gang, but pretends like he does. You even have him sometimes as a horrible father figure, the dark lens for Splinter in things like the Mirage or the IDW comics, where he brings in Leonardo as his Chunin, and he is a bad father figure for one of the turtles themselves. In this, I see Shredder himself as a child. Throughout most of the miniseries, it plays the Shredder and Krang as uneasy and unlikely partners. But by the end, Shredder is the whiny, rebellious teenager who is entitled and spoiled and crying to Krang about everything like Krang is his father. And their relationship will be more like that into the second season, where Krang won't give Shredder any technology until he beats the turtles on his own, kind of like a dad that's like a rich father who's cut off his kids to try to teach them a lesson. And I think that dynamic shifts so quickly because the Shredder is the Turtles' nemesis before he's Splinter's nemesis. They have a showdown a la Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi at the end of this, but it really feels throughout a lot more like Shredder is obsessed with the Turtles instead of obsessed with Splinter. It's really just as simple as their names are in the title of this cartoon, and they're trying to stop his plans, so like your average old school comic book villain or Power Rangers villain, Shredder stops worrying so much about what he's actually after and starts just attacking the hurdles that are standing in his way. And that's always the big fatal mistake, is the villain who loses sight of what he really wants and just trying to kill the superheroes. And if only he was a little smarter about just doing things secretly and making it difficult for them to find him and to know what he's doing, he might be able to get closer to achieving his actual goals and stop making his whole life about just killing these four turtles that have infinitely less resources and ability than he does. So at the beginning, when the turtles don't really know who they're fighting, it's just this mystery of who is this Shredder guy, what is he after exactly, what is this connection that he seems to have with Splinter. And as time goes on, they have a very personal vested interest in finding the Shredder and stopping him and hopefully being able to reverse engineer his technology that turned them into mutants in the first place. And I should mention that that is a really convenient thing in the origin of the Turtles in this version, that in order to kind of shoehorn in the idea that the Shredder made the Turtles and the Turtles made Shredder, the Shredder follows Splinter apparently to New York City, and then I guess loses him because he doesn't know that he's in the sewer. He never actually finds him, and then he very conveniently ends up dropping a bunch of his ooze into the sewer, not knowing that it's going to drop on Splinter and the Turtles. So what are the odds that in a city that large, he ends up accidentally creating the Ninja Turtles, who are connected to the guy that he was trying to find in the first place? By the second episode, the Turtles realize that the Shredder might have the means to turn Splinter back to human. Now, it is weird that the Shredder doesn't start talking about an anti-mutagen ray until he finally caves by the last episode and tells Krang, after he's defeated once again by the Turtles and the Neutrinos, by at least the second, if not third time the Turtles have been to the Technodrome. They wind up in the Technodrome a lot in the season. And he finally throws his hands up in the air and says, "Fine, I'll build you your stupid body. Just tell me how to defeat the Turtles." And it's a little ambiguous and convoluted, because every time the Shredder says, "I won't build your body until you tell me how to beat the Turtles," it seems like the way Krang wants to defeat the Turtles is with the bodysuit. So Shredder doesn't, and this is understandable and I like this a lot, Shredder doesn't trust that Krang won't double-cross him once he has his really powerful, unbeatable, seemingly bodysuit. And so he doesn't want to make that for him because Krang is pretty helpless, and is in a situation where he kind of has to just keep giving Shredder technology until he gets that suit. So he's got Krang very much over a barrel, but Krang thinks he's got something to hold over Shredder's head too, because he can't fulfill his plans until he's defeated the Turtles. I can't figure out if the way Krang is actually holding up his end of the bargain is to give Shredder the means to turn the Turtles back into regular Turtles, or if he could have just done that all along. It's not really talked about. It's just Shredder says, fulfill your end of the bargain, give me the means to destroy the Turtles, and I'll make your suit. And Krang says, okay. And he makes the suit, and there's a lot of parodies of the most obvious pop culture references and literary references that you would expect in this show. So, of course, he's got to do the Frankenstein thing. It's alive! It's alive! It's a really cool animation, though, in that scene where Shredder is bringing about Krang's body. And then right after that, he just has the anti-mutagen gun. Okay, pretty convenient and kind of shoved in there, and it feels very, 5-minute wrap-up where we have set up the idea of anti-mutagen, but we've never seen it. We don't know for sure if Shredder has it. And then it's like, well, we've got to bookend this because the Turtles think that Shredder might be able to turn Splinter back, so we have to introduce a thing at the 11th hour that will allow that to happen. There's some sloppy writing right there, certainly. But there's also this sloppy bit in episode before that, which I alluded to earlier, where the Turtles seem to momentarily forget why they're going after Shredder. There's this bit where Donatello is talking for a minute about not really wanting to have to go after Shredder and wondering why the Turtles have to do it because, and he's joking to some degree, but he's like, we're just these poor outcasts that the humans don't understand, and this is really the humans' problem. And Michelangelo makes the joke, well, it's the only job that we're qualified for. And I'm like, but you guys have a clear motivation for going after the Shredder. You've been talking about it the last 2 episodes. You need Shredder to help Splinter. And it's just really weird that it doesn't come up in that scene. So I guess collectively, if the Turtles have a character arc in this season, it's really just a reaffirmation of the importance of family and friendship and teamwork, where Splinter sacrifices his humanity for them, proving that he really hasn't lost his humanity in the ways that it matters at all. And there's not really a place where they're tempted to go against their values, or where there's a big lesson they have to learn, any major opportunity for change. They really just try to do the right thing and then put their lives on the line and then are rewarded by Splinter's sacrifice at the end. So it's a decent message for kids, I suppose, but it's a very old school golden age type superhero story where the heroes themselves, even if they are to some degree flawed and not perfect, which I'd argue these Turtles are at least superficially, where they're pretty one-dimensional. They've each got their prevailing character trait. We're kind of given their weaknesses to some degree, but there's never a major example where their weaknesses will get them into trouble. Like Raphael, instead of the standard hothead like he'll be later, is kind of just given the razor wit. He is really sarcastic, and that doesn't really get him into trouble. We're told that Michelangelo is more of the hothead, which is strange, because we don't actually really see that. We're just told in the second episode that he doesn't have a lot of patience. I guess we kind of see it in a training sequence, and it's set up almost like it's going to be the moral of the story that episode or something. That doesn't really play out. Leonardo could perhaps be too self-serious for his own good, but that doesn't ever become really a problem either, and Donatello is really just the device to make all of the technology happen. He does machines, of course. And the show really brings all of that stuff to the table in the first place, at least to some degree, building a little bit on what was in the comics, but kind of defining and making the Turtles more individually unique than they really were, at least at that point in the comics. They were pretty interchangeable for the most part by the point that the series starts getting into development anyway. Because remember, the series has only even been out for 3 years by the time that these episodes air. And I remember reading the first few issues and finding it difficult to tell sometimes, besides just what weapon they're holding, which turtle is talking. And not just because that book is in black and white, and because you don't have the color-coded headbands and the letters on the belt buckles, which this show brings in so that kids won't be confused, of course. But it's because they all kind of talk the same, and the show makes fun of that. In the first episode, April keeps going down the line, talking to each of them while they're on the street in disguise, and she gets all of their names wrong. But that's not to say that the show gives them a lot of dimension, just those initial prevailing character traits that a lot of other versions, especially the movie, especially the 2003 series, and even to arguably the Mirage comics later on themselves will kind of run with and do some stuff with. It's really interesting that this show was such an inspiration for Power Rangers, because the overarching skeleton of the plot of this feels like a Power Rangers episode, and feels like a Power Rangers origin too. You've got a set of teenagers who are just going about their own business, and then they find out that there's a villain who's trying to take over the world, and they have to stop it. Of course, again, the motivations are a little bit different, but that general idea is there. And then they develop an apparatus in order to stop that foe, and they're not given powers because they're deserving teenagers like the Power Rangers do with Zordon, but they do have a mentor figure who teaches them everything they need to know, and then they end up with gadgets in order to help them, gadgets and vehicles especially, in order to help them stop the bad guy. At the end, there is a massive giant villain that they have to fight, and they have to increase their apparatus in order to do that. So I guess the closest thing to a Megazord we get in this show is the Turtle Blimp, which is one of the most absurd ideas ever, that your heroes would need to make their own Zeppelin in order to fight the bad guys. But I do like that there is again, for this show at least, kind of believable origin for that, which is we were going to use a flying car from the Neutrinos, and the flying car broke down. So we took the guts of that and the weaponry on that, and we made a big blimp so that we could at least still get in the sky, and it was the best we could do on short notice. And the van is built more quickly than is probably believable, and it's hard to buy that it would look as polished and put together as it does. Same thing with the blimp, but again, it's got to look like that so that the toys will look cool and fun to play with. And I like that everything is so functional. I like that with the Technodrome and the blimp and the van, and even, the motorcycles that the foot soldiers ride, and there's kind of a tank thing that they have. All of that stuff functions the way the toys do. It shows you what you're going to be able to do with that stuff, with these highly detailed, multifunctional toys that are going to have a whole bunch of projectiles and various pieces and a bunch of decals and stuff that you'll get to put on them. What you see in the show is essentially like Power Rangers, again, you're gonna be able to do everything with them that you see in the show, and it's all really well demonstrated. I never really put together just how many things from the Ninja Turtles arcade game are actually directly from this first season, and I think that game was developed in conjunction with this, and nothing else had been made yet when that came out. There's a lot of elements that come from specific scenes in this that I thought was curious the first time, years ago, I played through the whole game, because it had been so long since I'd watched this miniseries. So I didn't remember that the Shredder has the multiple holograms of himself in the show like he does in the last fight in that game. The big boss battle at the end, kind of a la Superman 2. And it's in the show when he's fighting Splinter. Of course, you as the Turtles get to deal with that in that game. But there's also stuff like the Turtles getting turned into regular Turtles again with the anti-mutagen ray. They, of course, don't turn into Turtles, into small Turtles in the show, but that's what the Shredder's threatening them with, and so that comes right out of the show. And you even get that kind of famous shot from the cutscene at the beginning of that game. In a scene with a different context in this show, there's not a building on fire, but you get that shot of the Turtles all standing on a roof and then about to zipline down to the ground or another roof. And I didn't remember that was lifted directly out of the show, so that was all kind of neat. One thing that you don't get in the arcade game that will come later in Turtles in Time, of course, is Baxter Stockman as a fly being a boss, because that doesn't actually happen in this miniseries. He's handled a little bit more like he is in the comics, I suppose, in that he is forced to work for the Shredder, and he's not mutated yet. And I think he's thrown completely under the bus, and one of the cartoon characters that is treated least fairly in anything, and it's hilarious. Baxter Stockman in this first season is treated like he is culpable for everything he does, and like he's just as bad as the Shredder. Because again, we have no shades of gray, it's totally black and white, and even when there does seem to be a little bit of shades of gray, the characters don't realize it, and the show kind of hopes that you won't realize it either. So Baxter gets thrown away in prison for helping the Shredder. And the reason he helps Shredder is because he is bullied and strong-armed and kind of has no choice, and we treat it like he wanted to take over the city too. In fact, the Turtles talk about it like that. Oh, Baxter's in jail because he tried to take over the city. No, he didn't. He tried to solve the city's rat problem by creating a bunch of robots that would go out and eat all the rats, which seems like a public service to me. And when he meets Shredder, he doesn't even understand what Shredder is after and thinks that he also just wants to get rid of all the rats. But Baxter Stockman has no malicious motivations whatsoever. He's a completely tragic figure. He's a total victim through all of this, and I have nothing but sympathy for Baxter Stockman. I haven't talked much about April. She's, of course, just the stand-in for Lois Lane here. She's changed from Baxter Stockman's lab assistant, like she is in the comics, to a typical news reporter, so that she can help the Turtles find where the villains are in any given episode and to get her more in the middle of the action. I like her spunk in this and her wit, such as it is. She is as strong a female character, I think, as you'll find in a late 80s Saturday morning cartoon. Certainly she has to get kidnapped, but then she's not the only one. 3 out of 5 episodes of this miniseries, characters are getting kidnapped. So the girl, of course, has to be the damsel in distress, gets kidnapped first episode. But at least it doesn't happen all throughout. At least she's not kidnapped at the beginning and has to get rescued in the 5th episode. And at least she's proactive and independent and fends for herself pretty well, despite the fact that she also has to faint twice when she sees the Turtles and then Splinter, which is also a thing that other versions do, and I think she faints in the movie too. But that's the thing that we're always doing with women in the late 80s, early 90s things. But, I mean, Splinter gets kidnapped in the second episode, and Michelangelo gets kidnapped in the third episode. So you sort of have the trifecta of characters that are always getting kidnapped in Ninja Turtle stuff, except usually it's Raphael instead of Michelangelo, but then the show can't decide which of them is the impulsive hothead, so it's kind of appropriate that he's the one that gets kidnapped in this show, I suppose. I, of course, again, have a lot of nostalgia for this show, and it's more fun to go back to than it probably would be for a lot of people watching it in the first place for the first time as adults, especially if they're already familiar with other iterations. You really have to have some historical perspective and appreciate what the show is after and who it's for, which I don't think is confused at all. I think the show knows exactly who it's for. I don't think it's interested at all in the adults in the room, and if you can imagine yourself as a child in this period, or if you're my age and you can go back to your childhood, I think this is a more fun show to watch. But I do think that, again, that first season holds up a lot better than a lot of the rest of the show, and it's a little more audacious and has a little more of a real sense of adventure than it will later on, and so it holds up a bit better for me anyway. This is a weird thing to rate. I don't know what exactly I'm even comparing it to besides just the rest of the series. This is not a thing that I asked for tweet-length reviews for, because this is a show that unfortunately isn't streaming anywhere still. I might have thought that it would have been on Paramount Plus, considering Nickelodeon owns all of this, but so far all we've gotten is the '03 show there, and I'm really glad that we have that, and I would like to maybe do some overviews of that down the line as well. A little more meat there, a little more story stuff we can sink our teeth into, but I watched this show on my complete box set that looks like a turtle van, which is really cool, and if you want to try to get this, I don't think you're going to spend more than $80 or $100 on it. So I'm going to rate this season a 2.5 out of 4, just for my own personal enjoyment, I suppose. Again, at some point I would like to do a top 10 on this, and I'll probably do, when I get to that, a top 10 of all of the episodes after this, because I would, at the moment anyway, probably put this at the top of that list as just one, long decompressed episode. But anyway, thanks as always for watching, folks. I'm interested to read comments on this and see how some of you guys feel about the show all these years later, and especially anybody that is watching it for the first time, if you're able to get your hands on this, or if you're reevaluating it after not seeing it from when you were a kid. This was a lot of fun to talk about. Hope to come back and do some more stuff on this show eventually. Not going to put this in Letterboxd or anything, of course, because it's not a movie, but we'll go back to ranking things again when we get back to movie reviews. Thanks a lot to the patrons for all of your support. If you'd like to become a Geekvolution patron, you can go to patreon.com/Geekvolution. At just the $2 tier, you get early episodes of Superhero Rewind. At the $5 tier, you can leave tweet-linked reviews for most of the things I talk about here on Superhero Rewind. I want to say special thanks individually to all of our Patreon producers at the $10 tier right now, including Blake, Chewbacca's Lover, Dylan Muschiello, Gooster123, Hot Soup, Ian McKee, Jeremy Scott, John Sandoval, Bag Studios, Carl Maxey, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, Malik Myers, Matthew Bass, SS, Jerry, Stone Gassman, The Day Ghost, Tomids, Edgehill, Caleb, and CM Productions, Damon McGay, Jacob Schneider, Joey Whalen, Kareem Roberts, Michael Gulick, Michael Micheletti, Wendell Jones, and Zach. You guys are awesome. Really appreciate you. I will see you guys again real soon with another one. I was Captain Logan, and thanks for watching. Bye.